Paris was never her birthplace, yet Paris would eventually claim her. New York would crown her. London would measure her fortune, and Melbourne would remember her beginnings. But before all the capitals and the skyscrapers, before the salons and the operas and the paintings, there was only Kraków, a provincial city in the late 19th century, still bound to the partitions of Poland, still caught between empires that tugged at its borders. Kraków gave Helena Rubinstein the first tools she needed: hunger, endurance, and a clear eye for survival. She was born Chaja Rubinstein in 1872, the eldest of 8 daughters in a modest Jewish family. The Rubinsteins lived close to the Jewish quarter, where language mixed Polish, Yiddish, German, and where girls were rarely granted ambitions beyond marriage and motherhood. But Helena was restless from the start. She noticed faces. She noticed skin. She noticed how women measured their own worth by the reflection in a mirror, and how that reflection was usually tinged with disappointment. Her father expected her to conform to marry quickly and bring a dowry of respectability. But Helena resisted. She attended school, read widely, and learned to calculate. More importantly, she learned to argue. Why must beauty be left to chance? She once asked a family friend. The question was childish in form, but radical in its implications. To her, beauty was not simply inherited. It could be crafted, corrected, even sold. That conviction would become her empire. In Krakow's narrow streets, she also learned the weight of prejudice. Being Jewish in fin de siècle Eastern Europe meant enduring the casual insult, the structural exclusion, the occasional violence. Helena developed a resilience that looked from the outside like defiance, but it was less about pride than about necessity. If doors closed, she would build her own. By her late teens, she had already begun to rebel against her family's expectations. Suitors arrived and left. She found none of them equal to her ambition. She wanted the world, not a neighborhood. And when the chance appeared, a ticket to Australia courtesy of an uncle who thought she might make a respectable match in Melbourne, she took it. The voyage was long, but to Helena it was liberation. The ship carried immigrants of every kind: fortune-seekers, debt, escapees, dreamers, drifters. Helena, small in stature but sharp in gaze, spent the weeks at sea observing. She studied the women around her, the dryness of their skin in the salt air, the chapping of their lips, the fatigue etched around their eyes. Most of them had no resources beyond soap and hope. She thought of her mother's homemade creams thick with lanolin from sheep's wool, scented faintly with herbs. She had watched her mother stir those mixtures in their kitchen in Kraków, handing them out to neighbors as small comforts. On deck, Helena realized she might be carrying not just a memory but a secret. Lanolin, she knew, protected skin against the harshest weather. Australia, she had been told, was full of sheep. Perhaps fortune had already stowed away in her luggage, disguised as knowledge. When the ship finally docked in Melbourne, Helena was ready to experiment. Melbourne, in the 1,890 seconds, was prosperous but provincial. The gold rush had built mansions, but the culture lagged behind Europe. For an ambitious immigrant, opportunities were limited unless one could create them. Helena, with her sharp accent and sharper tongue, quickly realized that employment would be difficult. But she also realized that women in Australia, scorched by sun and wind, were desperate for skin relief. She began mixing creams in her boarding house, using lanolin supplied by local sheep farmers. She added almond oil, herbs, and a touch of perfume. The result was a product unlike anything her neighbors had seen. She packaged the cream in simple jars and called it crème valaise. The name suggested European sophistication, though the formula was born of necessity. Word spread quickly. Society, women, always alert for novelty, adopted it first. Then middle-class women followed, saving coins for the promise of smoother skin. Within months, Helena was no longer a curiosity, but a supplier. By the turn of the century, she had opened her first salon in Melbourne, offering not only creams, but consultations. She studied each client, diagnosing skin types, prescribing regimens, speaking with the authority of a doctor, though she had never set foot in medical school. What she sold was not merely a product, it was a system. And behind that system was a philosophy: beauty is power, and power can be democratized at a price. Helena understood instinctively what later generations of marketers would codify a brand is a story. She reinvented herself as Madame Rubinstein, an expert from Europe, worldly and refined. She wore dramatic clothes, styled her hair severely, and cultivated an accent that made her origins mysterious rather than provincial. Clients did not simply buy a jar of cream, they bought entry into a narrative of sophistication. By 1902, her business in Australia was thriving. She sent for her sisters from Kraków, employing them in her growing chain of salons. Each salon became both a laboratory and a stage where women could enact transformations. The Rubinstein sisters became apostles of beauty, spreading the gospel of crème valaise across the continent. But Helena was restless again. Australia had given her success, but not influence. To shape culture, she knew she needed Europe. Paris called. Arriving in Paris in 1907, Helena entered a city intoxicated by modernity. The Belle Époque was in full bloom. Picasso painted in Montmartre Proust, wrote in cork-lined rooms Stravinsky composed for the Ballets Russes. To succeed here required more than business acumen. It required cultural literacy. Helena opened a salon near the Champs. Élysée draped it in elegance and filled it with mirrors. She courted actresses, singers, and socialites, offering them not only creams, but the performance of transformation. Soon her name appeared in gossip columns attached to the faces of women who defined Parisian chic. But Paris offered something more dangerous and more alluring: the avant-garde. In galleries and studios, she encountered paintings that confounded her cubes, abstractions, wild colors. At first, she dismissed them as nonsense, yet gradually she saw parallels between her work and theirs. She, too, was challenging tradition, rewriting the codes of femininity. If Picasso could insist that a face be reconstructed into angles, could she not insist that skin could be reconstructed into youth? It was in Paris that her worlds of commerce and culture began to intertwine. Beauty generated profits. Profits bought art. Art conferred legitimacy. Helena realized that to be more than a merchant, she had to become a patron. Around this time, Helena married Edward Titus, a Polish-American journalist and intellectual. Titus introduced her to writers and artists, drawing her deeper into avant-garde circles. Through him, she learned the language of collecting provenance, taste, the politics of display. The couple acquired works by Matisse Picasso and Modigliani, purchases that shocked some friends who saw them as grotesque or incomprehensible. But Helena trusted her instincts. Just as she had recognized the potential of lanolin, she now recognized the potential of modern art to redefine culture. Her salons grew ever more theatrical. She installed art on the walls, blending commerce with curation. Clients waiting for facials might find themselves staring at a Picasso. The effect was deliberate. Beauty was not a frivolous indulgence, but part of a larger movement of modernity. World War I disrupted everything. Supplies vanished, clients fled, Paris darkened. But Helena did not collapse. She relocated temporarily to America, bringing with her the lessons of Paris and the energy of survival. New York proved fertile ground. In a city of immigrants and strivers, her story resonated. She opened a Fifth Avenue salon that combined science with spectacle. Treatments were described in quasi-medical terms. Creams were presented as necessities rather than luxuries. At the same time, she cultivated glamour. Chandeliers sparkled, staff wore uniforms, and every jar carried her signature. By the war's end, Helena Rubinstein was no longer just a name. It was an empire. Branches extended from Melbourne to London, Paris to New York. Rivals emerged, most famously Elizabeth Arden, whose red-doored salons would duel with Rubinstein's for decades. But Helena, hardened by Kraków, tempered by Australia and refined by Paris, never flinched. Competition, she believed, proved the market's size. What distinguished Helena Rubinstein from her competitors was not merely product but ideology. She taught that beauty was not vanity but necessity, a form of social armor. For women entering workplaces, attending universities, or seeking independence, appearance could open or close doors. She argued that skincare was not indulgence but preparation. Her advertisements reflected this seriousness. They spoke of science analysis and modern methods. She hired chemists to refine formulas, created classifications for skin types, and insisted that every client could be improved. The message was radical in its own way. Beauty was not bestowed by birth, but could be constructed through knowledge and discipline. At the same time, Helena never forgot the power of spectacle. She herself was small, barely 5 feet, yet she dressed in extravagant gowns and jeweled turbans. She turned her body into an advertisement, proving that reinvention was possible. To see her enter a room was to understand that confidence could be bottled and sold. By the 1,920 Helena Rubinstein was among the wealthiest women in the world. Her fortune allowed her to indulge passions beyond business. Chief among them was art. She collected voraciously, acquiring not only established names but emerging ones. Her apartments became museums filled with Picassos, Dali's, Chagall's, African masks, and jewelry displayed like sculpture. But she did not hoard privately. She lent works to exhibitions, supported young artists, and commissioned portraits. To be painted by an avant-garde artist and to hang in Rubinstein's salon was a mark of arrival. She used her wealth not simply to adorn her walls, but to shape the conversation of modern art. Her philosophy was clear. Just as she democratized beauty, she sought to democratize art. If women of modest means could buy a jar of cream that carried Parisian chic, why should they not also be introduced to the canvases that defined the new century? She blurred the lines between commerce and culture, making each reinforce the other. By the end of the 1,920 Helena Rubinstein was no longer merely a businesswoman. She was a symbol, the poor Jewish girl from Kraków, who had built an empire from sheep's grease and imagination, who now presided over salons that doubled as galleries, who counted among her friends, artists, writers, and politicians. But challenges loomed: the Great Depression, wars yet to come, betrayals in marriage, and the constant battle against age, both her own and her clients'. For Helena, each challenge was an invitation to reinvent, and in reinvention lay not only profit but posterity. If business is theatre, then rivalry is its most reliable drama. By the 1,920 Helena Rubinstein had already conquered Melbourne, Paris, and New York. Her name glittered on jars of cream and above salons draped in velvet. Yet across Manhattan another name was rising in equal splendor: Elizabeth Arden. Arden's salons glowed with red doors, promising refinement to American women eager for sophistication. She marketed in pastel tones, spoke in soothing assurances, and offered beauty as a promise of gentility. Rubinstein, by contrast, thundered with authority-prescribed regimens like a doctor and treated beauty as discipline. The two women never met, and perhaps that was wise. Their contempt for each other was legend. Helena sells hope, Arden once sneered, while I sell results. Rubinstein fired back. Arden sells fantasy, I sell science. Between them they constructed the modern beauty industry, two immigrants, two self-invented women, locked in a duel across continents. The rivalry was more than personal, it was ideological. For Rubinstein, competition validated the seriousness of the market. If Arden offered facials in pastel parlors, Rubinstein would offer laboratories staffed with chemists. If Arden courted debutantes, Rubinstein would court intellectuals and artists. Each step one took the other countered. Their duel elevated the entire industry, drawing women across class lines into the rituals of skincare. Then came the Great Depression. Fortune shrank, markets collapsed, and luxury seemed doomed. Department stores shuttered, banks failed, and unemployment soared. For many businesses tied to appearance, the future looked bleak. But Helena Rubinstein did not retreat. She adapted. Instead of abandoning luxury, she reframed it. Advertisements proclaimed that beauty was not frivolous but essential, a shield against despair. Invest in your face. One campaign urged, for it is the only asset that never depreciates. The slogan was more than clever. It was survival strategy. Helena also adjusted her pricing. She introduced smaller jars at lower costs, ensuring that even women with modest incomes could still afford the reassurance of her creams. In this, she demonstrated a shrewd understanding of psychology. When the world collapses, people cling to rituals. A jar of crème glacée became not merely a cosmetic, but a talisman. The Depression also tested her as a collector. With markets in turmoil, many collectors liquidated. Prices for modern art plummeted. Helena, ever contrarian, bought. She acquired Picassos and Dalis at prices unthinkable a decade earlier. To her downturns were opportunities. Just as she had once recognized the hidden power of lanolin, she now recognized the hidden power of undervalued art. Helena Rubinstein never collected quietly. Her apartments in Paris, London, and New York became spectacles. Guests entering her New York townhouse on Park Avenue found themselves surrounded not only by Picassos and Chagalls, but by African masks, Byzantine icons, and jewel-encrusted tiaras displayed as if they were sculptures. Her collections were eclectic, almost anarchic. Critics sometimes mocked the lack of cohesion, but Helena insisted that her eye, not tradition, was the unifying principle. "I buy what speaks to me," she declared, "and if it offends, all the better." She hosted salons where painters debated with poets, where dancers collided with financiers, where actresses compared facials under the gaze of cubist portraits. To be invited was to step into a theater where commerce and culture danced together. Her salons became laboratories of taste where art was not hidden in museums, but lived with, argued over, and sometimes ridiculed. For Helena, patronage was both conviction and performance. She believed in supporting artists, but she also believed in displaying that support as part of her identity. A woman who had sold jars of cream could not merely hang Picassos in private. She had to flaunt them to prove that beauty and art were part of the same empire. The 1,930 seconds saw Helena double down on her rhetoric of science. She employed chemists in white coats, published pamphlets on the physiology of skin, and promised clinically tested results long before such phrases became clichés. Her salons resembled laboratories with glass counters and diagrams of pores. Clients felt less like customers and more like patients submitting to expert care. At the same time, Helena herself became part of the spectacle. Barely 5 feet tall, she towered in photographs through turbans, piled high necklaces layered thick, and gowns cut dramatically. She looked less like a beautician than a monarch. When asked why she dressed so extravagantly, she replied, "Because I must be visible. If I were ordinary, no one would believe me." This duality, science and spectacle, defined her brand. On one hand, she promised rational, measurable improvement. On the other, she embodied fantasy, a living advertisement for reinvention. The tension was not contradiction, but strategy. Women bought both assurance and aspiration. Back in Paris, Helena's salons flourished once more. She mingled with society figures, artists and writers who defined the interwar years. At her dinners, one might find Jean Cocteau sketching on napkins, Pablo Picasso arguing with Gertrude Stein, or Salvador Dalí proposing outlandish schemes. She cultivated artists not only as collectors, but as collaborators. She commissioned interior designs for her salons, asking modernists to reimagine spaces of commerce as spaces of art. One salon featured mirrored walls and geometric patterns that echoed Cubist canvases. Another displayed murals by artists whose reputations were still fragile. By embedding art into her business, she legitimized both. But Paris also reminded Helena of vulnerability. Anti-Semitism simmered beneath the surface, and whispers of war grew louder. Though she rarely spoke publicly about her Jewish identity, it shaped her resilience. She knew that fortunes could vanish overnight, that prejudice could undo decades of labor. The memory of Krakow's streets never left her. Her marriage to Edward Titus unraveled during these years. Titus, brilliant but restless, drifted into affairs and debts. Helena, uncompromising in business, was equally uncompromising in private. Their divorce was bitter, but not ruinous. She kept custody of her empire, the true marriage of her life. She reinvented herself once more, cultivating the persona of the indomitable Madame Rubinstein. She was no longer merely the immigrant girl who sold lanolin creams. She was the global authority on beauty, a woman whose opinions on skin, art, and society carried weight in capitals. And she was wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy. By the mid-negative 1,930 seconds, she was among the richest women in the world. Forbes once estimated her fortune at over $100 million, an astonishing sum in that era. Yet she lived with the energy of someone still proving herself, still climbing. New York in the 1,930 seconds was a paradox. Skyscrapers rose even as breadlines lengthened. Into this city, Helena brought European glamour. Her Fifth Avenue salon became a palace of mirrors, chandeliers, and marble floors. Treatments were administered with clinical precision, yet the setting suggested royalty. She cultivated celebrities, opera singers, Hollywood actresses, socialites. Each became both client and advertisement. When society pages reported that a starlet had been seen at Madame Rubinstein's, readers understood that beauty was not optional but obligatory. But Helena also democratized access. She struck deals with department stores, ensuring that her creams were available not only in salons but in aisles where ordinary women shopped. The paradox deepened exclusivity sold in mass. She managed to convince women that by buying her products they entered a world of refinement, even if they never set foot in her Fifth Avenue palace. By now, her art collection had grown into one of the most eclectic in private hands. She owned Picassos that baffled visitors, Chagalls that enchanted them, Dalís that unsettled them. She also collected African sculpture, textiles, and jewelry, insisting that beauty was not confined to oil on canvas. Critics accused her of vulgarity, of buying too much too quickly, of lacking a coherent philosophy. Helena shrugged. "I do not buy to please critics," she said. "I buy to please my eyes." Yet she understood that art conferred credibility. To be a mere merchant of creams might relegate her to the margins of society. To be a collector of modern art placed her at its center. She positioned herself not simply as a businesswoman but as a patron whose taste mattered, and in doing so she blurred the boundaries between commerce and culture. In 1938, against expectation, Helena married again. Her second husband was Prince Archil Gurievich Konya, a Georgian aristocrat, decades her junior. The marriage raised eyebrows and provoked gossip. Some saw it as a romantic indulgence, others as a calculated alliance. Helena marketed a line of products under his princely name, turning matrimony into merchandising. But personal affairs soon gave way to global catastrophe. World War II erupted, and Paris, her beloved Paris, fell under Nazi occupation. As a Jewish woman, she could not return. She settled instead in America, watching from afar as Europe convulsed. Her fortune insulated her, but the losses were personal friends, displaced communities, destroyed collections, threatened. Yet even in wartime, she refused to retreat. She continued to operate salons, produce creams, and even launch new campaigns. Beauty, she insisted, was not cancelled by war. When everything else is uncertain, she told a journalist, a woman must still have her lipstick. By the 1,940 Helena Rubinstein's identity as a patron of modern art was inseparable from her identity as a beauty tycoon. Museums courted her loans, artists sought her endorsement, and society gossiped about her latest acquisitions. She funded exhibitions, underwrote galleries, and advised young collectors. She believed that art must circulate, not stagnate. Her apartments were constantly rearranged, new pieces entering old ones, leaving the whole collection alive with change. She also began to dream of permanence. What would happen to her collection after her death? How could it survive beyond the fluctuations of fashion? These questions marked the beginning of her transformation, from collector to founder, from consumer of culture to its custodian. By the 1,940 Helena Rubinstein's New York residence had become one of the city's most astonishing private palaces. Located on Park Avenue, the townhouse was less a home than a manifesto. Walls pulsed with modern canvases, Picassos hung beside Chagall's, a Matisse lit the stairwell, a Dali glared from the drawing room. In the dining room, African masks presided like ancestral spirits. Jewel-like Byzantine icons sparkled under discreet lights. Visitors spoke of sensory overload, a museum condensed into domestic space. Some critics whispered the word vulgar, but others recognized her vision. She was constructing not merely a private collection, but a theater of identity. Each room staged her rise from Kraków to global authority. Each canvas testified that beauty could fund culture, and each artifact announced that commerce and art were not enemies, but conspirators. She received guests there with the confidence of royalty. Society matrons, expecting polite dinners, instead encountered Picasso's fractured faces and Dali's melting clocks. For many, the shock was deliberate. Rubinstein knew that conversation sharpened when provoked. Just as her creams promised transformation through discomfort, tingling, tightening, peeling, her salons of art promised transformation through provocation. Of all the artists in her collection, Pablo Picasso fascinated her most. She bought his works when many collectors still hesitated, sensing that his distortions carried a new grammar. Where others saw brutality, she saw invention. Her affinity was personal. She, too, had built a career by reshaping faces. Picasso dismantled noses and eyes. She restructured skin with creams and treatments. Both insisted that beauty was not passive, but constructed. She commissioned portraits from artists who interpreted her visage through their own lenses. In one, Picasso reduced her features to angular planes, more emblem than likeness. In another, Dali exaggerated her eyes into surreal orbs. These portraits did not flatter, they challenged, yet Helena embraced them. To hang such images was to announce that she was not afraid of transformation, that she understood beauty's power to disturb as well as to console. For her clients, the message was clear: the woman selling creams was also the woman brave enough to let Picasso dissect her face. Confidence, she implied, was the ultimate cosmetic. Her collecting ambitions eventually spilled into public institutions. In 1959, the Museum of Modern Art in New York mounted an exhibition drawn from her holdings. Critics who once scoffed at her taste were forced to acknowledge its breadth and daring. The show placed her alongside names like Peggy Guggenheim and Gertrude Vanderbilt, Whitney women whose patronage had shaped modern art's American destiny. But Helena wanted more permanent imprint. She financed the Helena Rubinstein Pavilion of contemporary art in Tel Aviv, a gesture that fused philanthropy with heritage. As a Jewish woman who had escaped the pogrom-shadowed streets of Kraków, she understood the importance of giving Israel a cultural anchor. The pavilion displayed not only European modernism, but also works by Israeli artists, validating a young nation's artistic voice. Here, beauty funds literally became bricks and mortar, profits from jars of cream translated into walls where art could breathe. Customers buying moisturizer in Cleveland or Sydney were unwittingly underwriting exhibitions in Tel Aviv. Rubinstein's genius lay in making commerce and culture mutually reinforcing. New York high society, notoriously guarded, at first treated Rubinstein as an outsider, an immigrant, a merchant, a woman who sold jars instead of inheriting jewels. But her persistence wore down prejudice. She hosted dinners where dukes sat beside, dances where financiers confronted canvases they did not understand, and where actresses found themselves debating critics. Gradually, the social pages began to include her name without hesitation. The cosmetics queen was now also the great collector. Even those who dismissed her taste could not ignore her influence. She had purchased her way into the conversation, but she had also earned it through audacity. She once quipped, "There are no ugly women, only lazy ones." Society applied the line to her career as well. There are no excluded women, only those too timid to fight their way in. The end of World War II deepened her resolve. News of the Holocaust devastated her. Many relatives and friends from Poland had perished. Though she rarely discussed religion publicly, she increasingly identified with Jewish causes. She donated to hospitals, schools, and cultural organizations within Jewish communities worldwide. Her art patronage, too, carried this undertone. Supporting the Tel Aviv Pavilion was more than philanthropy. It was survival of memory. Each canvas hung there was a refusal to let culture die with bodies. Each exhibition proclaimed that Jewish creativity belonged to modernity, not only to nostalgia. Rubinstein's life embodied the paradox of assimilation and difference. She had built her empire by appealing to universal desires for beauty, yet she never forgot the specificity of her origins. Her philanthropy balanced both universal modernism funded by a very particular Jewish determination to endure. Back in New York, her Fifth Avenue salon continued to redefine beauty. She pioneered the concept of the beauty laboratory, complete with microscopes, charts of skin layers, and technicians in white coats. Women entered as patients and exited as transformed subjects. She classified skin into types, dry, oily combination terms, still used today. She introduced the notion of preventive care, urging women to begin treatment early rather than waiting for wrinkles. She sold not just creams, but education, teaching women to analyze their own faces with clinical precision. At the same time, she dramatized the experience. Uniformed attendants guided clients into mirrored rooms where light dramatized their features. Treatments felt ritualistic, almost sacramental. Rubinstein fused science with theater, convincing clients that they were participants in modernity itself. By the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, Hollywood stars flocked to her salons. Actresses understood that appearance was currency, and Rubinstein offered both maintenance and mystique. She treated Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, and countless others. Some she befriended, others she used as walking advertisements. She also collaborated with costume designers and makeup artists, ensuring that her products appeared on sets and in dressing rooms. A Rubinstein lipstick on a film star became free publicity. In an era when Hollywood exported beauty ideals worldwide, Helena positioned her brand at the source. Her influence extended backstage. She advised on lighting, on how certain powders responded to film stock, on the chemistry of color under arc lamps. She was not simply selling creams, she was engineering cinema's glow. Unlike some collectors who treated art as investment, Helena lived with her works intimately. She placed a Picasso in the kitchen, a Chagall in the bathroom, a Dali in the hallway. She claimed that art should not be hidden in vaults, but encountered daily like friends. Her staff sometimes found it bewildering. Preparing breakfast beneath a cubist portrait was hardly ordinary. But for Helena, the extraordinary was the point. If women could normalize facials and lipsticks, why should they not normalize living with masterpieces? She believed that familiarity bred appreciation. Just as repeated application of cream improved skin, repeated exposure to art improved taste, culture, she argued, was a habit. By mid-century, Rubinstein was lending works to major exhibitions. Museums valued her willingness to part temporarily with treasures. It gave them access to Picassos and Matisses, otherwise locked in private hands. She enjoyed the prestige, but she also enjoyed the control curators courted her. Critics debated her choices, and the public learned her name not only from beauty ads, but from exhibition labels. She once said, "I sell beauty for the face, and I buy beauty for the wall. Both are my business." The symmetry was perfect. Cosmetics generated capital. Capital purchased art. Art legitimized cosmetics. Few collectors managed such a closed loop of cultural power. As her fortune grew, Helena began to contemplate permanence. She imagined a museum that would bear her name, a monument not only to the art she loved, but to the woman she had become. The idea was both egotistical and visionary. She understood that legacies fade unless concretized in institutions. She began planning, drafting, negotiating. Which works would go where? How would visitors experience them? Could her philosophy of transformation extend from skin to canvas, from salon to gallery? Though she would not live to see every plan realized, the ambition itself altered her collecting. She bought with an eye to narrative, considering how pieces might converse in public rather than merely decorate private rooms. She was curating a museum of the self, not in vanity alone, but in recognition that her life had fused commerce and culture in ways no one else had attempted. By the 1,950 Helena Rubinstein had become unmistakable in appearance. Photographs show her in towering turbans, ropes of pearls, brooches shaped like animals, gowns patterned with audacity. She looked less like a business executive than like a queen of some invented realm. This was intentional. Style was her armor. In boardrooms dominated by men, in art circles dominated by aristocrats, she compensated for her lack of pedigree with overwhelming presence. To underestimate her because of her size under 5 feet was a mistake many rivals made once. Her style also reinforced her philosophy. Beauty was power, and power was visible. She was living proof that cosmetics were not trivial, but transformative. Every newspaper photograph, every magazine spread became unpaid advertising. She turned herself into her brand's most effective billboard. As she aged, Helena faced the irony of her empire. She sold youth, while her own face betrayed time. She responded not with concealment, but with audacity. She wore even larger jewels, even brighter fabrics, even bolder turbans. She laughed that wrinkles were inevitable, but style was eternal. Clients found reassurance in her confidence. If the queen of cosmetics could age without apology, perhaps they could too. Helena turned her own aging into another lesson that beauty was not the absence of years, but the presence of vitality. By the 1,950 Helena Rubinstein's empire stretched across continents. Her name appeared in department stores from New York to Buenos Aires, London to Sydney. The post-war boom fueled a surge in consumer culture, and Rubinstein seized the moment. While other luxury brands hesitated, fearing that mass distribution might tarnish exclusivity, she expanded aggressively. Her advertisements spoke the language of modernity, science, progress, efficiency. She promised creams that contained vitamins, serums, infused with hormones, treatments that echoed the vocabulary of medicine. She hired dermatologists and chemists, ensuring that every product was marketed as more than mere makeup. To purchase Rubinstein's creams was to participate in a scientific revolution for the skin, but she also understood the need for fantasy. Campaigns featured glamorous models draped in pearls, salons glowed with chandeliers, and her personal image, jeweled turbans, dramatic gowns appeared in magazines. She straddled both worlds, rational science and extravagant spectacle. Women trusted her because she embodied both. In New York, her Fifth Avenue salon evolved into what she called the House of Beauty. Entire floors were devoted to treatments. Electrical machines promised to stimulate circulation. Ultraviolet lamps claimed to rejuvenate tissue. Powders were matched to skin tones with mathematical precision. Attendants wore white uniforms, lending the air of a clinic. She published manuals on skin care detailing regimens for every age. "There are no ugly women," she insisted, "only lazy ones." The phrase became both slogan and challenge, pushing women to invest in their appearance as a duty. Beauty was no longer a frivolity, it was a discipline. Her approach influenced the entire industry. Competitors scrambled to match her rhetoric of science, her integration of laboratories into marketing, her insistence that every woman could and should manage her face as carefully as her finances. By mid-century, Helena Rubinstein began to channel her fortune into philanthropy. She endowed foundations supporting medical research, particularly in dermatology and ophthalmology. She funded scholarships for women in science, insisting that opportunities denied to her generation should not be denied to the next. In 1953, she established the Helena Rubinstein Foundation, which became a major benefactor of educational, scientific, and cultural initiatives. Hospitals received grants, universities established fellowships, museums mounted exhibitions with her support. She viewed philanthropy as both obligation and strategy. It ensured her legacy, while reinforcing her brand as synonymous with progress. Her giving reflected her dual identity. As a businesswoman, she invested in science that validated her products. As a collector, she invested in art that validated her taste. As a Jewish immigrant, she invested in education and cultural institutions that defended memory against erasure. In 1964, Rubinstein stunned the art world by announcing a massive auction of her collection. Over decades, she had amassed thousands of works: Picassos, Dallas Matisses, African masks, jewelry, rare textiles. Now she was selling. Critics accused her of inconsistency. How could a self-proclaimed patron liquidate her treasures? Was it greed, whim, or shrewd calculation? Helena shrugged. She claimed she wanted to reorganize, to prevent clutter, to refresh her surroundings. But the auction also demonstrated her pragmatism. Art was not only cultural capital but financial capital, and she was unafraid to treat it as such. The sales broke records, drawing collectors from across the globe. Some mourned the dispersal, others marveled at her ability to command headlines once more. She had turned even divestment into spectacle. Yet she continued to buy, replenishing what she sold. Her apartments remained vibrant, museums constantly shifting. For Helena, collecting was never about permanence, but about momentum. One of her proudest achievements was the Helena Rubinstein Pavilion of Contemporary Art in Tel Aviv, opened in 1959. The pavilion housed exhibitions of modern art, both European and Israeli, and signaled Israel's place in global cultural networks. For Helena, the Pavilion fused business, art, and identity. It proclaimed that a Jewish immigrant who had once fled prejudice could now return triumphant as benefactor. It also linked her brand to the new state of Israel, associating her creams not only with beauty, but with cultural endurance. The Pavilion remains a testament to her vision that beauty and art are inseparable, that commerce can fund culture, that legacy requires institutions. Throughout her career, Helena Rubinstein fought a persistent stereotype that she herself was not beautiful. Critics described her as short, plain, even unattractive. Rivals whispered that the Queen of Beauty lacked beauty herself. Helena countered with wit and audacity. "There are no ugly women," she repeated, "only lazy ones." She insisted that beauty was not innate, but constructed, that discipline and style mattered more than bone structure. She turned insult into philosophy. Her own appearance became her argument. She did not attempt to look like a Hollywood starlet. Instead, she embraced turbans, jewels, and dramatic clothes, creating a style unmistakably hers. She did not sell herself as an example of natural beauty, but as proof that self-invention was possible. Clients who doubted their looks saw in her a validation. If Rubinstein could command the world through style, so could they. In the 1,960 seconds, now in her 80s, Helena remained active in business. She attended board meetings, toured salons, and scolded managers with the sharpness of someone half her age. She refused retirement, claiming that work itself was her elixir. She continued to innovate. She launched new lines of cosmetics targeting younger consumers, aware that youth culture was transforming the market. She experimented with bold packaging, bright colors, and partnerships with fashion designers. Even as wrinkles deepened on her face, her brand remained contemporary. Competitors marveled at her stamina. Elizabeth Arden had died in 1966, but Helena pressed on, determined not to cede the stage. She seemed to feed on rivalry, as if opposition itself were a form of nourishment. Her second husband, Prince Archil Gurievich Konya, had died in 1955. Their marriage, once derided as a marketing ploy, had nonetheless provided companionship. After his death, Helena focused even more fiercely on her work and philanthropy. Her sons, raised partly by tutors and partly in the shadow of her business, pursued their own careers, though never escaping her dominance. Family tensions simmered, as in many dynasties. Helena's empire was her true child, and she guarded it with maternal ferocity. As she entered her 90s, Helena Rubinstein remained a figure of astonishment. Journalists who interviewed her in her final years described a woman still dressed in flamboyant turbans, still surrounded by Picassos, still issuing orders with uncompromising clarity. She spoke often of legacy. "I built my business with creams," she said, "but my real work is building confidence." She wanted the world to remember not only her products, but her philosophy that beauty was power, discipline, and self-invention. She arranged her affairs with precision. She ensured that the Helena Rubinstein Foundation would continue its work after her death, funding science, education, and art. She secured the survival of her Tel Aviv pavilion. She left instructions for the management of her empire, determined that her name would endure beyond her lifetime. Helena Rubinstein died in 1965 at the age of 93. Newspapers across the world carried obituaries describing her as the Empress of Beauty, the Queen of Cosmetics, the patron of modern art. She had outlived most of her rivals, outlasted wars and depressions, and transformed an industry. Her funeral in New York was attended by dignitaries, artists, business leaders, and former employees. Tributes poured in from museums, universities, and foundations she had supported. She left behind not only a fortune, but an empire, one that would continue, though without her formidable presence, it would never be quite the same. Historians now recognize Helena Rubinstein as more than a businesswoman. She was a pioneer of branding, a master of self-invention, a patron whose eclectic tastes helped legitimize modern art, and a philanthropist who directed wealth toward science and education. She transformed beauty from frivolity into discipline, from indulgence into necessity. She democratized access while cultivating exclusivity. She blurred the boundaries between commerce and culture, showing that profits from creams could build pavilions and sponsor exhibitions. Her legacy is visible not only in the beauty industry, but in museums where her name still appears in foundations that continue to fund research and in the very language of skincare that echoes her classifications. Helena Rubinstein was nothing if not meticulous. In her final decade, she spent as much time orchestrating the survival of her empire as she did expanding it. She knew that a business built on personality was vulnerable once that personality was gone. Arden's brand, too, was showing signs of fragility after its founder's death. Helena was determined to avoid that fate. She reorganized corporate structures, appointed managers she trusted, and reinforced the brand's scientific image so it would outlive her own flamboyance. She endowed her foundation generously, ensuring that her profits would flow into science, art, and education long after she herself had disappeared. She did not speak in terms of mortality, she spoke in terms of continuity. "I have always opened my salons on time," she quipped. "When I leave, I expect the doors to open still." In April 1965, Helena Rubinstein died in New York at the age of 93. Newspapers across the world reported the news with a mixture of awe and incredulity. The little Jewish girl from Kraków had built an empire that spanned continents, shaped the faces of millions, and filled museums with art once dismissed as madness. Obituaries praised her as a business pioneer, a cultural patron, a philanthropist. Some mentioned her short stature, her thick accent, her uncompromising will, but most marveled at the scale of her achievement. She had transformed sheep's lanolin into a global industry, and then transmuted profits into modernism's legitimacy. Her funeral was attended by artists, socialites, scientists, and former employees. It felt less like the passing of an individual than the end of an era. After her death, the company changed hands multiple times. Without her iron grip, it struggled to maintain the same authority. Managers came and went. Product lines shifted. Competitors surged. Eventually, the brand became part of larger corporate conglomerates, its founder's name surviving mostly as a logo. Yet the memory of Madame Rubinstein persisted. Advertisements still featured her quotes, magazines still recalled her turbans, and salons still bore her initials. In a sense, she had succeeded. Her persona remained inseparable from her products even when others controlled them. Her art collection underwent a similar fate. Some pieces entered museums, others were sold at auction. Critics lamented the dispersal, but the sales also spread her influence. Works once crowded into her Park Avenue townhouse now hung in institutions across the world, their provenance marked by her name. To encounter a Picasso or a Chagall with the label formerly collection of Helena Rubinstein was to glimpse her shadow. Her Tel Aviv pavilion endured, preserving her commitment to Israel's cultural landscape. The Helena Rubinstein Foundation continued funding art and science. Her legacy, though fragmented, remained visible in multiple arenas. In the decades since her death, Helena Rubinstein has been remembered in many ways. Business historians hail her as a pioneer of branding, one of the first to transform cosmetics into a science-driven global industry. Feminist scholars point to her as proof that a woman born without privilege could dominate markets, command boardrooms, and rival men in wealth. Cultural critics examine her collecting as both audacious and erratic, noting her willingness to buy what others despised, her refusal to follow orthodox taste. For some, she was a visionary who saw modern art's future, for others, a brash merchant dressing her walls. Both views acknowledge her impact. Biographers linger on her contradictions. A woman who democratized beauty yet lived in extravagant exclusivity, who fought prejudice yet sometimes echoed its harsh judgments, who claimed science but revelled in spectacle. She embodied the tensions of the 20th century, where commerce and culture, identity and reinvention collided daily. Was Helena Rubinstein a feminist? She rarely used the term. She did not march in suffrage parades, nor did she write manifestos. Yet her life constituted a form of feminism in practice. She built an empire without male sponsors, supported women scientists, and proved that wealth could secure autonomy. She also reshaped the relationship between women and their bodies. By insisting that beauty was not trivial but essential, she challenged patriarchal dismissals of appearance. Critics argue that she also reinforced pressure on women to conform. But for many clients, her message was liberating. They could control how they looked rather than submit to fate. Her feminism was pragmatic, rooted in commerce, sometimes contradictory, but it expanded possibilities. In that sense, she joined the ranks of women who changed the world, not by theory, but by enterprise. Looking back, Helena Rubinstein's greatest innovation may have been to link two domains rarely combined, beauty and art. She saw that cosmetics generated profit, and profit could buy credibility. But she also saw that art gave meaning to commerce, transforming jars of cream into symbols of modernity. She insisted that beauty was discipline, a daily ritual of self-care, a responsibility. She insisted that art was salvation, a way of protecting culture, of rescuing voices from dispersal. Together they formed her creed, Beauty Funds, modern art, and modern art legitimizes beauty. This creed still resonates. Walk into a department store today, see cosmetics advertised with references to art and design, and Helena's ghost is there. Visit a museum exhibit sponsored by a luxury brand, and her blueprint is visible. The intersection she pioneered has become common ground. In our century, where beauty industries are trillion-dollar empires and art auctions command astronomical sums, Helena Rubinstein feels prophetic. She anticipated influencer culture by turning herself into her brand. She anticipated globalization by operating across continents. She anticipated philanthrocapitalism by channeling profits into cultural institutions. Her story warns as well as inspires. She reminds us that beauty can liberate but also enslave, that art can be preserved but also commodified, that empire can elevate but also exploit. She demonstrates that success built on personality must plan carefully for succession or risk dilution. Above all, she shows that identity can be crafted. Born Chaja Rubinstein in a modest Kraków household, she became Helena Rubinstein, Madame of Beauty, patron of Picasso, benefactor of Tel Aviv. The transformation was neither accident nor destiny, it was will. Stand in front of a mirror with a jar of cream. Stand in front of a Picasso in a museum. In both, Helena Rubinstein whispers the same lesson. Beauty is work, art is work, and both deserve seriousness. She insisted that skin deserved laboratories and that canvases deserved patrons. She turned sheep's lanolin into global commerce, then turned that commerce into cultural legacy. Her empire may have fractured, her collections may have scattered, but her philosophy remains intact. To care for the face is to care for the self, to care for art is to care for humanity. One without the other is incomplete. That is the meaning of Beauty Fund's modern art. It is not merely a slogan, it is the architecture of a life.